Margaret Johnson, an 80-year-old woman, walked into a luxury car dealership dressed simply and was looked down upon by the salespeople. Expelled from the place, she returned, but this time with a plan that would forever change everyone's perception of who she really was. The return of the heiress, when humility defeats prejudice. Margaret Johnson, an 80-year-old lady, woke up that morning determined to fulfill a promise she had made to her husband, Donald. He had been hospitalized for months, battling a devastating cancer, and his condition was worsening by the day. But there was one last thing she wanted to do for him, something that made him smile even in the toughest moments: buy the Ferrari of his dreams. With this mission in mind, Margaret chose her simplest clothes: a faded blue cotton dress and a pair of comfortable but worn-out shoes. She grabbed her old canvas bag, the same one she had been using for years to go shopping, and left her modest home, a reflection of her priorities that always stayed far from luxury. Upon entering the luxury car dealership, the contrast between her appearance and the showroom's shine was immediate. The place exuded wealth. The cars sparkled under the lights, as if every detail was there to reaffirm the exclusivity of the place. The salespeople, lined up in impeccable suits, were used to recognizing potential clients with a single glance, and Margaret, in their eyes, did not seem to be one of them. She walked to the center of the showroom, observing every detail of the displayed cars. Her gaze was serene but determined. As she approached a red Ferrari, its vibrant color seemed to light up her tired eyes, and for a moment she could picture Donald's smile upon seeing it. One of the salespeople, Matthew Brown, watched her from a distance. He was a middle-aged man with years of experience in the business. Something about Margaret piqued his curiosity. She was not like the other clients he was used to seeing there, but still, Matthew decided to approach her. "Good morning, ma'am. Can I help you?" Matthew asked with a polite smile. Margaret looked at him, and in her eyes Matthew saw a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I'm interested in that Ferrari," she said, pointing to the car she had been admiring. Matthew was surprised but maintained his composure. "It's a magnificent car, ma'am, one of the best we have here." Before he could continue, the dealership manager, Jacob Taylor, a young and ambitious man, approached. He had a clear policy about who should or shouldn't receive attention in the store, and Margaret didn't seem to fit the profile. "Ma'am, perhaps you should look elsewhere. This car isn't available for a casual test," Jacob said, his tone dripping with disdain. Margaret raised her eyes to Jacob, showing no signs of anger or offense. "I'm not here for a test. I want to buy it," she replied firmly. Jacob laughed, a cold and unpleasant sound. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't accept just promises. Maybe you should try somewhere else." Those words felt like a blow, but Margaret maintained the dignity that life had taught her to preserve. She simply nodded, turned around, and left the store, feeling the disdainful stares following her to the door. Matthew, who had been watching the scene with discomfort, hesitated for a moment before making a decision. He knew Jacob wouldn't approve, but something compelled him to act. He picked up the bag that Margaret had forgotten on one of the benches and ran after her. When he caught up with her outside, he extended the bag towards her. "You forgot this," he said gently. Margaret stopped, looked at Matthew, and in an unexpected gesture smiled. "Thank you, young man. You were very kind," she said, taking the bag back. There, in front of the cold facade of the dealership, Margaret paused. "I have a story to tell you if you have a minute," she said, and Matthew, intrigued, nodded. At a nearby cafe, they sat at a secluded table. Margaret carefully placed her bag next to her chair, as if it contained something of great value. "My name is Margaret Johnson," she began, her voice calm and steady. "You must be wondering why a woman like me in such simple clothes would be interested in a car like that." Matthew nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Johnson, I admit I was surprised, but I don't judge people by their appearance. Everyone has a story, and yours seems special." Margaret smiled, appreciating his sincerity. "My husband, Donald, has always been passionate about cars, especially Ferraris. When we were young, he dreamed of buying one, but life took us down different paths. We had responsibilities, children to raise, a house to maintain, and the dream of the Ferrari got left behind. Now, with his health so fragile, all he wants is the chance to drive one of those cars, even if it's just for a single day." Margaret's voice wavered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. Matthew, touched by the story, felt a growing empathy for the woman willing to do anything for the man she loved. "I sold almost everything we had to pay for Donald's treatments," Margaret continued. "Our house, the furniture, even some family jewelry. I have little left, but I was determined to buy that Ferrari. I didn't want him to leave without fulfilling that last dream." Matthew felt a lump in his throat upon hearing this. Most customers who entered the dealership were in search of status, wanting to show power. But Margaret was there out of love, with a genuine desire to bring happiness to her husband in his final moments. "I confess I don't have enough money to buy the car outright," Margaret admitted, lowering her eyes. "But I was willing to negotiate, to make a down payment and finance the rest, perhaps sell what little I still have. I just wanted Donald to have this joy." Matthew remained silent for a few moments, absorbing the depth of the situation. He knew that the dealership's policy was inflexible, especially under Jacob's management, which valued quick profits over the human stories behind purchases. But there was something about this situation he couldn't ignore. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I would like to help in some way." Margaret looked at him, surprised. "Help? But how, my son?" Matthew took a deep breath. He thought of his own savings, the money he had been saving to buy his own car. A modest car, nothing compared to the Ferrari, but it represented his independence. Looking at Margaret, he knew that money could mean so much more. "I have a little saved up," Matthew finally said. "Maybe it's not much, but if it can help cover the amount you need, I would like to do that." Margaret was in shock. She never expected someone to offer to help in such a way. Tears filled her eyes, but she held them back. "You would do this for me? A complete stranger?" she asked, her voice choked. Matthew nodded. "I don't think we're complete strangers, Mrs. Johnson. I believe our lives crossed for a reason." Those words warmed Margaret's heart in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She took Matthew's hand and squeezed it firmly, showing her gratitude without needing to say anything more. "Then let's go back to the dealership," Margaret said with renewed determination. "Let's buy that Ferrari." With the decision made, Margaret and Matthew returned to the dealership. This time, Margaret's demeanor was different. There was a serenity in her walk and a determination in her eyes. Matthew, at her side, felt confident, even though he knew convincing Jacob Taylor wouldn't be an easy task. As they crossed the dealership door, the same salespeople who had ignored her before looked at her in surprise. They didn't expect to see her back, let alone accompanied by Matthew, who seemed more determined than ever. Margaret headed straight for the red Ferrari that had so captivated her heart. Jacob Taylor, observing the scene from his office, immediately came out to meet them. His expression was one of irritation at seeing that Matthew was bringing back the woman he had clearly dismissed. "Ma'am, I thought I made myself clear earlier. This isn't a place for short rides," Jacob said, with a sarcastic smile that didn't reach his eyes. Margaret looked at him but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened her canvas bag and began pulling out bundles of cash, carefully stacking them. The silence in the dealership was absolute. All eyes were fixed on the unusual scene. "This is enough for the down payment," Margaret said, with a firm voice that left no room for doubt. "I will complete the rest with financing. If you need guarantees, I can provide them." Jacob was momentarily speechless, but soon regained his composure. And what makes you think you'll be able to pay for the financing? You don't seem to have sufficient resources." Before Margaret could respond, Matthew intervened. "I'm willing to guarantee her financing," he said, looking Jacob in the eye with seriousness. "Whatever she can't cover with the down payment, I will complete." The manager looked at him incredulously. "Matthew, are you really willing to commit your savings to this situation? Do you know what you're doing?" Matthew held his gaze steady. "Yes, I know what I'm doing. And I believe this is an opportunity to do something that really matters." Jacob sighed, clearly dissatisfied, but realizing he had little more to argue. Margaret was offering real money, and Matthew, a respected salesman, was willing to put his word and savings on the line. "All right," Jacob finally said reluctantly. "Let's get this paperwork sorted, but know that I'm doing this against my will. And Matthew, I hope you know what you're doing." With Jacob's authorization, the purchase began to be processed. Matthew accompanied Margaret to the office to sign the documents, while Jacob watched from a distance, still incredulous about what was happening. At the end of the process, Margaret held the keys to the Ferrari in her hands, a small smile of satisfaction lighting up her face. "I don't know how to thank you, Matthew," she said, emotional. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Johnson. I just want to know that your husband will have the joy he deserves," Matthew replied, feeling a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced in his career. With the keys in hand, Margaret did something unexpected. She walked to the door of the dealership, looked at the gleaming Ferrari, and then turned back to Matthew. "Come with me," she said, waving for him to follow. Without hesitation, Matthew walked alongside her to the car. Margaret extended the keys to him. "Would you like to drive? I think my husband would be happy to know it was you who brought this happiness to him." Matthew, surprised by the gesture, hesitated for a moment, but seeing the sincerity in Margaret's eyes, he took the keys. "It would be an honor, Mrs. Johnson." The two got into the Ferrari, and as the engine purred softly, Matthew guided the car out of the dealership. The drive to the hospital was silent, but filled with meaning. Margaret watched the streets pass by the window, lost in thoughts about how much life had changed since Donald fell ill. And now, thanks to a stranger who had become a friend, she was about to fulfill her beloved's last wish. When they arrived at the hospital, Matthew helped Margaret out of the car and accompanied her to Donald's room. Upon opening the door, the smile on Donald's face was confirmation that all the effort had been worth it. "Margaret, you really did it," Donald said, his voice weak but filled with emotion. Margaret approached him, holding his hand tenderly. "I did it, my love. And it was thanks to this young man, Matthew, who helped us make it possible." Donald looked at Matthew, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You don't know how much this means to me." Matthew, touched, simply nodded. It was an honor to help. With Margaret and Matthew's assistance, Donald was taken to the Ferrari. Despite his weakness, he insisted on sitting in the driver's seat, the smile on his face saying more than any words could express. He started the engine, and with a sparkle in his eyes that hadn't been seen in a long time, he drove the car through the hospital parking lot, fulfilling what would be his last great dream. The sound of the Ferrari's engine reverberated through the hospital parking lot as Donald, though frail, experienced the sense of freedom he had longed for. With Margaret by his side in the passenger seat, he drove the car with an almost reverent care, as if each second behind the wheel was a precious gift. Matthew watched from a distance, feeling a mix of joy and melancholy. That moment, so simple yet so powerful, was a reminder that often the greatest gifts we can give are not material things, but experiences that touch the hearts of those we love. When Donald finally stopped the car, there were tears in his eyes, but his smile was wide and sincere. "Margaret, this was the best gift I could have ever received," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I can't express how much this means to me." Margaret held his hand tightly, trying to hold back her own tears. "All I wanted was to see you happy, Donald. And knowing that I succeeded, well, that means everything to me." Matthew approached, feeling that this moment was something sacred between them, but knowing he needed to say goodbye. "Mr. Jones, Mrs. Johnson, it was an honor to help fulfill this dream," he said humbly. "Now, I think you two need some time together." Donald nodded, still holding Margaret's hand. "Matthew, you're not just a car salesman. You're a man with a great heart. And that's why I want you to know that this car, this Ferrari, is no longer mine. It belongs to you now." Matthew stood frozen, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Mr. Jones, no, I can't accept this. This car is your dream." Donald smiled, a smile full of peace. "I have fulfilled my dream, Matthew. And now, I want you to have yours. I know you will use this gift in a way that honors what it represents to me and to Margaret." Margaret, still by Donald's side, exchanged a knowing glance with Matthew. "Donald is right, Matthew. You did much more than sell a car. You brought joy and comfort to a man's heart in his final days. And for that, we want you to have this Ferrari." Matthew, deeply moved, tried to refuse, but the sincerity in Margaret and Donald's eyes made him understand that this was more than a gift. It was a symbol of everything they had experienced together. He finally nodded, accepting the key that Donald handed him with a solemn gesture. "I promise to take care of it with all the respect it deserves," Matthew said, his voice choked with emotion. "And every time I drive it, I will remember you both and what this car represents." Donald gave a final wave before being taken back to his hospital room. Margaret accompanied her husband, feeling an inner peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. That day, she had achieved more than just fulfilling a dream. She had found a new friendship and a new way of looking at life. The days that followed were serene for Donald and Margaret. They spent every moment together, sharing memories and expressing the love that had united them for so many years. They knew the end was near, but they were at peace with it, comforted by the certainty that they had lived a full and meaningful life. Finally, on a calm morning, Donald fell asleep and did not wake again. Margaret was by his side, holding his hand when he departed peacefully. There was no sadness in her eyes, only gratitude for the time they had spent together and for the love they shared until the last moment. After Donald's funeral, Margaret returned to the dealership. She found Matthew, who was still processing everything that had happened. He was surprised to see her again, but Margaret had something more to say. "Matthew, I know you feel honored to have received the Ferrari, but there's something else I would like to ask," she said softly. "Of course, Mrs. Johnson. Anything," Matthew replied sincerely. "I would like you to consider this Ferrari as a symbol of something greater. Use it to remind people that a person's worth is not in their appearance or the money they carry, but in the heart they possess. If you can do that, then you will truly be honoring Donald's memory." Matthew nodded, feeling the weight and responsibility of that request. "I promise, Mrs. Johnson. This Ferrari will be much more than just a car for me. It will be a constant reminder that true wealth lies in compassion and humanity." Margaret smiled, satisfied with his response. "Then my heart is at peace, Matthew, and I know Donald would feel the same." With that farewell, Margaret left the dealership, knowing that although her journey with Donald had come to an end, the legacy of love and compassion they left behind would continue to live on through Matthew's actions and the stories of all who heard theirs. Days passed after Donald's funeral, but the impact of his story and Margaret's generosity did not diminish. Instead, the tale of the couple began to spread throughout the city and eventually across the country, inspiring people to reflect on the true meaning of wealth, compassion, and human dignity. At the dealership, Matthew Brown was no longer just a salesman. he had become a respected and admired figure among colleagues. The Ferrari he now owned was not just a luxury car, but a symbol of kindness and human connection that transcended any material value. He kept it in perfect condition, but rarely drove it for personal purposes. Instead, he used it for charity events and to raise funds for important causes, honoring Margaret's request to use the car for something greater. The culture of the dealership also began to change. Jacob Taylor, initially reluctant to accept the transaction involving the Ferrari, was forced to rethink his attitudes. The story of Margaret and Donald made him realize how far he had strayed from the values that truly mattered. Inspired by Matthew's transformation, Jacob implemented new policies at the dealership, ensuring that all customers were treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance or financial status. Margaret, for her part, did not retreat into a life of mourning after Donald's death. Instead, she found a new mission: to help those in need. With part of the resources she still had, she founded a support program for low-income seniors, providing care, shelter, and dignity to people who, like her, had rich life stories but were often overlooked by society. Matthew joined her in this project, offering his time and resources to ensure that the initiative thrived. The friendship between Margaret and Matthew blossomed, uniting two generations and showing that, regardless of age, everyone has something to offer and to learn. They became an example for the community, proving that true wealth lies in how we treat others and the compassion we show in our daily actions. As the years passed, the story of Margaret and Donald, and the young salesman who changed their lives, became a local legend. People told this story as a life lesson, teaching new generations that a person's worth cannot be measured solely by what they own, but by what they are capable of doing for others. Margaret lived her final years in peace, surrounded by friends, and the certainty that, even after Donald's death, she continued to make a difference in the world. And when her time came to depart, it was with the same dignity and serenity she had demonstrated throughout her life. At Margaret's funeral, many people gathered to pay their last respects. Among them was Matthew, now a respected man with his own legacy of kindness and generosity. He spoke on behalf of everyone, recalling the words Margaret always said: "True wealth lies in what we leave for others, not in what we accumulate for ourselves." After the funeral, Matthew drove the Ferrari one last time, taking it to the charity event that Margaret had organized years earlier. There, he decided to auction the car, donating all the proceeds to the senior support program she had founded. It was his way of perpetuating Margaret and Donald's legacy, ensuring that their stories continued to inspire future generations. And so, the story of a humble woman, a dreaming husband, and a young salesman became an everlasting example of how love, compassion, and dignity can transform lives, leaving a lasting impact on the world. We hope you enjoyed this narrative. Help by leaving your like and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss more emotional stories that touch the soul. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. We would love to hear what you think, and thanks and critiques are also welcome. See you in the next emotional video. Until then,